Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 2025 Federal Election Forum on Early Childhood. My name is Sam Page. I'm the CEO here at Early Childhood Australia, and it's my pleasure to be your MC for this evening. I'll begin with an acknowledgement of country. So Early Childhood Australia acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their continuing connection to land and community. We acknowledge the wisdom from more than 65,000 years of educating and caring for young children and pay our respect to elders both past and present. I'm on Ngunnawal country here in Canberra, and if you would like to acknowledge the land that you're on, please do so in the chat. This evening's forum is an opportunity for you to hear from and engage with candidates from the major parties and the crossbench, to hear about the policies and positions relevant to young children and early childhood professionals. We had over 800 people registered for the forum on Zoom. It's also being live streamed on Facebook and will be recorded so that it's available for people who couldn't make it this evening. Thank you to everyone who submitted questions as part of the registration process. You're also welcome to put questions and comments in the chat, which will be moderated by the team here tonight. We also have moderators on the Facebook live stream. But please understand that the volume of questions means that we can't get to all of them, so we have condensed and combined questions where we can. We'll do our best to cover as much ground as we can within the time that we have with the candidates. We ask that in the chat you are respectful both towards the candidates who have given up their time during a busy campaign week and also to other participants. So keep your comments succinct and polite, please. We're not able to be as interactive as we have with forums in past elections where we've been able to invite people on screen to ask questions just because of the time constraints and the number of people participating. So we'll cover the questions as well as we can. We're going to begin by inviting each of the candidates joining us this evening to provide a brief summary of their policy positions, and then we'll get into questions and some discussion. So I'm going to do a quick introduction of each of the candidates joining us tonight. Dr. Anne Alley has been the federal member for Cowan in Western Australia since 2016 and is also the Federal Minister for Early Childhood Education, Minister for Youth and the Minister assisting the Minister for the National Disability Insurance Scheme in the Albanese Labor government. Welcome, Anne. Angie Bell was elected to Federal Parliament in 2019 as the member for Moncrieff in Queensland for the Liberal National Party. Angie serves as Shadow Minister for Early Childhood Education and Youth and is the founder and patron of the Gold Coast Impact Youth Summit. Welcome, Angie.
Thank you.
Zoe Daniel is the community-backed independent member for Goldstein in Victoria, elected at the federal election in 2022 following a successful career in journalism. Welcome, Zoe.
Thank you.
And Steph Hodgins-May is Senator for Victoria, appointed to the Parliament in 2024. She is the Australian Greens spokesperson on early childhood education and care, as well as science, industry and innovation. Welcome to all of you. And I'm already talking too fast. This is my thing that I need to slow down, take a breath. But we are really grateful for all of you. We know how busy it is during a campaign, and this has been a fairly short one. So we appreciate you making time this week to share with us your priorities and policy positions. We look forward to hearing from each of you. So I'll invite each of you to provide a brief summary of the key policies that you're taking to this federal election and your aspirations for children, families and the early childhood sector. And we'll start with you, Minister.
Oh, thank you, Sam. Just to acknowledge that I'm coming to you all from beautiful Wajak Noongar Budja here in the West, and I've seen there's quite a few people from Wajak country here, so I acknowledge elders past, present and emerging, and also acknowledge any First Nations people joining us here today. Thanks so much for putting this on. Look, the Albanese Labor government has always been very clear about our aspiration for early childhood education and care, and the Prime Minister has committed to building a universal early learning system that is simple, that is affordable, that is accessible for every single Australian child and family. Our aspiration is across 4 pillars, the first being that every family should be able to access at least 3 days of high quality early childhood education each week. And we made that a reality when we introduced our legislation to replace the unfair and punitive activity test with our 3-day guarantee. We want to transform early childhood education and care to ensure that educators and teachers are truly valued for what they do. For too long, educators and teachers have been undervalued, and we understand that a strong workforce is really the pillar, the foundation of any future reform that we want to do. That's why we introduced our 15% pay increase as well as changes to industrial relations laws that have assisted early childhood education and care sector. So in our first term, we had the decrease in out-of-pocket costs, and today out-of-pocket costs are still lower than when we first introduced our legislation, saving the average family around $4,400. We've had that 15% wage increase, as I mentioned. We've abolished the unfair and prohibitive activity test, and we have committed to $1 billion to build Early Childhood Education Fund. It's called the Building Early Childhood Education Fund, building services in unserved and underserved areas. We've also announced plans to strengthen our powers to deal with providers who persistently put profit above quality and child safety. Since we came into government, there are now more than 1,100 new services, more than 40,000 educators, and 100,000 additional early childhood education places. We know there's work to do. We're committed to continuing to work with ECA as well as other stakeholders, all of you, in our reform journey. But we've articulated a very clear journey that we are taking to a universal early childhood education and care system. We've got the blueprint for that through our ACCC and our PC reviews, and I look forward to continuing to work with everyone here.
Thank you. Thanks very much, and we'll get into some of the details there in a minute. But Shadow Minister, can I invite you to provide an opening statement?
Thank you so very much, Sam. And I do understand this is not a debate as such, but I just wanted to start by just thanking everybody that's come online today. Thank you to Minister Ali, obviously to Steph and also to Zoe for joining us here today. Tonight, this is obviously a very, very important sector of which I'm very passionate, and I think we'll get to that. But I want to talk certainly about our priorities, which is part of the question, and probably no surprise that our priorities are very similar because we all understand what the challenges are across the sector, but certainly safety and quality is so very, very important as the two most important things. And we have, as a coalition in principle, agreed to the Minister's statement on safety to continue working with the states and territories to make sure that we can ensure children's safety as the number one priority. It certainly is mine, and I know that the Minister will agree, and certainly the other elected members here online, spokespeople, will agree that children's safety is certainly number one. Accessibility, affordability and workforce are obviously the other two areas that are of paramount importance, and I think improved accessibility is so very important. I would like to highlight that those new places that the Minister highlighted really have been delivered in the main by for-profit providers across the country. But what we want to see is more accessibility in those unserved markets in particular, and underserved markets, and that's why we announced our $100 million Raising the Regions fund just a couple of weeks ago for regional Australians who simply do not have any access at all, because to those families, Sam, a 3-day guarantee is worth nothing when you can't get access even for 1 day because the town that you're in or the area that you're in simply doesn't have any accessibility whatsoever. So we want to see more flexibility and choice for families. I've said that from the very beginning, and as I've travelled around the country, particularly in those childcare deserts where 25% of Australians live, in childcare deserts, with families with their children on their laps crying that they can't go to work because there is no accessibility. And I'll just highlight that the government hasn't changed those families' lives. But I will say that raising the region's funding $100 million over 2 years, and then, of course, the $1 billion regional Australia Future Fund, which will continue, part of that will continue to fund early childhood education and care as well. We don't oppose the beef, that $1 billion fund, but we don't believe that the Albanese government will deliver that as they didn't under Prime Minister Rudd either, way back when they used it last time. But I will say that $1 billion, every cent of that will go back into early childhood education and care under a coalition government. I'd also highlight our $3.8 million Ready to Read program that Senator Henderson and I announced a couple of weeks ago in Sydney for children's literacy. So we want to support that as well, obviously. When it comes to affordability, out-of-pocket costs right now are up since Labor's changes to the cheaper childcare legislation. Out-of-pocket costs are actually up by 12.7%. It's in the data. And the cost of delivering childcare, of course, is up by over 22%. So the government has spent $8 billion and, in our view, not delivered for Australians. Australian families don't have access, particularly if you're living in the regions. They don't have cheaper childcare, as the Prime Minister is spruiking. And we think that there should be targeted assistance to those families who need it the most. And that is those families who are working, studying, even volunteering, and also those that are most vulnerable. And those exemptions, of course, already exist with the activity test in place. Fourthly, the workforce is so very, very important. And I think that our Raising the Regions funding can be used to backfill staff. It can be used it will be able to be used to upgrade qualifications as well for educators. So I think that is so very, very important as well moving forward. So they are my priorities should I be the minister after the election, have the great honour of doing that. I'll end with that, Sam, for now, but certainly just to highlight some of those key policies.
Thank you. And yes, this isn't set up to be a debate, but it's good to understand where the common ground and where the differentiation is. Of course, the best thing for the early childhood sector is bipartisan support across the whole parliament, but we are trying to keep everybody informed about where the parties stand and also what we might expect from the next term of parliament. Turning to you, Zoe, would you like to make an opening statement?
Thank you, Sam. Hi, everyone. I'll acknowledge the Bunurong and Bunwarang people of the Kulin Nation here in Goldstein in Bayside, Melbourne. I think that we have a real opportunity to transform early childhood education and care in this country. I think it was Samantha Mostyn, now the Governor-General, who likened this structural change that's ahead of us to as big a structural change as the introduction of Medicare. And I think that this is an enormous opportunity for children, women, families, and the economy. Of course, everyone on this call knows that giving our kids the best start in life is our central aspiration, and the early years are critical. They set the foundations for a child's development and learning trajectory. And of course, early childhood education also unlocks the economic potential of women. So from my point of view, gender equality is one of the key pillars of the work that I've done so far in the Parliament, and what I aspire to continue to do should I be re-elected. And one of the central aspects of that, of course, is that women in Australia are among the most highly educated in the world and have similar levels of labour force participation to men until they have children, when they begin to fall behind and then they never catch up. So the extent to which childcare or early childhood education is available and affordable has consistently been found to lift rates of female participation, and more women working boosts economic growth and tax revenue. So we have to remove this barrier of women returning to work for the sake of women and families, many of whom are facing real cost of living pressures. I know this. I talk to these women every day. I've been talking to them for the last week and a half in the pre-poll queues, and every woman who comes through with a young child, and indeed older women who've had children, understand the importance of this policy space. Here in Goldstein, I'm aware that a lot of women can't afford to work, even as they can't afford not to work. They are stuck in that vortex of the cost of childcare being prohibitive. But of course, the cost of housing in my electorate is so enormous that most families really need both partners to be working. So it's really problematic trying to find a balance for people. The cost of care in Australia is among the highest in the OECD, and certainly in my electorate is often the second highest expense in a household after the mortgage. And then unaffordable care results in parents, usually women, deciding not to work, and then they begin that lifelong gendered financial disadvantage, and they never catch up. So as policymakers, I really firmly believe that we have to address the lack of accessible and affordable care. This is why I pushed really hard for the 3-day guarantee to be legislated at the end of the last parliament, and indeed pushed for that change throughout that parliamentary term. There were signs that the bill was going to get held up in the Senate and not get passed, but thankfully it got through in those last days, and that was a fantastic moment, because the 3-day guarantee ensures that children can access early childhood education and care despite what their parents do. It'll replace the activity test, and I campaigned for that to be abolished throughout the last term. And it is the most disadvantaged kids and families who will benefit most from this, and that is a huge win. Angela Jackson, the economist, found that scrapping the test would allow 126,000 kids from low-income families to access care, and 40,000 parents, mostly women, to re-enter the workforce, and that also the activity test would inject removing the activity test would inject $4.4 billion into the economy. This policy has been backed by dozens of organisations, from the Business Council of Australia to the ACTU. It's been recommended by the Productivity Commission, the ACCC, the Women's Economic Equality Advisory Task Force, and the Economic Inclusion Advisory Committee. I'm really pleased to see that it went through, and I'm really disappointed that the Coalition has said it'll reinstate the activity test if it happens to win the election. I will fight to keep the 3-day guarantee if I am re-elected and sitting on the crossbench, because it's an important step. It's just a step towards the flat fee system of universal childcare, which is, I think, where we need to get to. Everyone on this call would know that the Prime Minister has said that he supports a flat fee system of $10 to $20 a day, and that we need to get there in stages. I agree that we have to get there in stages, and those stages include addressing workforce shortages, service availability, and the funding model. And to keep that on track, I support the establishment of an Early Childhood Commission to determine a national approach to regulatory standards and to oversee the rolling out of a universal early childhood system. As a nation, I really believe that we should be embracing this opportunity for enormous change to benefit women, children, families, and the economy. Thanks, Sam.
Thank you. We're covering a lot of ground already with the opening statement, so thank you for each of you for putting so much thought into them. Turning to you, Steph, the Greens have made quite a substantial policy announcement just recently.
Can I do my opening? Sorry.
Yes. No, absolutely. Sorry, I am going to invite you to do your opening statement.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Great. Sorry, I thought we were moving into questions. But thank you so much, everyone, for joining. And I'd also like to acknowledge that I'm dialing in from Wurundjeri Wurrung country, and pay my deep respects to elders past and present, any First Nations people on the call tonight, and a special shout out to Snake if they're on the call. I've been in the Senate for about a year now and adopted this portfolio, and a big thank you to every single one of you from the sector who has helped me navigate this incredibly complex area and helping me navigate that journey. Look, the Greens fundamentally come at the fundamental principle that we consider needs to be paramount is that early childhood education is an essential public service, just like primary and secondary school. We think that every single child deserves the very best start in life, and we know that this is best achieved through high quality, free, universal childhood education and care. We've committed that this will be a priority for us if we're in balance of power after Saturday's election. Because I'm hearing from people right across the state that families are being priced out of childcare, and we know that our educators are being underpaid. Despite the 15% increase, we've been championing a 25% increase, consistent with what the unions have been calling for. And many profit-driven providers, not all, but prioritising profit over our kids' wellbeing, and that's deeply concerning to us. The Greens have delivered a plan. We've announced it recently to deliver truly universal high-quality early childhood education. We want to phase out the childcare subsidy altogether and transition to a new model that directly funds childcare services to provide free early education and care for families, just like our schools. Like, you drop your child off, you don't have to deal with Centrelink, you don't have to. I saw a comment in the chat about, the amount of hours being spent waiting to speak to someone at Centrelink to give your kids those crucial early years education. We just don't think that that's working. Our plan would have every child receive 50 hours of free learning every week, and all 3 and 4 year olds would get 30 hours of preschool, no matter their postcode or family income. It shouldn't be a postcode lottery for your child to get a really strong early education. This will not only ease cost of living pressures, but it'll empower families, and as Zoe talked about, especially women, to make real choices. Whether they want to be a stay-at-home mum or whether they want to go and advance their career, they'll have that choice and they'll be able to make that decision. We want to close the access gap as well. I grew up in country Victoria. I had an op-ed in the paper this week, and they removed the line that said that my dad, who was a farmer, would sometimes put my sister and I in a hole when he was moving heavy equipment because we didn't have childcare nearby. And we want to address this by investing in a $2 billion childcare desert fund to expand access where it's needed most, plus an immediate $200 million to cut wait lists at existing services. And it's, when we're talking about maybe 100 million towards this, and we're looking at the astronomical costs that are going into things like AUKUS, this is our kids' education. It's just so vital. It's such an important investment in our future. We want a new $5 billion fund to grow high-quality public, not-for-profit and community-run childcare, which we know is consistently delivering the best outcomes and highest quality care for our children. We want to safeguard the quality of our early childhood education, and we've announced establishing a new independent early childhood education and care commission. This was a recommendation of the Productivity Commission, but we also think that it should have enforcement powers to be able to shut down rogue operators, to lead research, and to truly guide us on this transition towards a universal system. Importantly, we really want to value the incredible work of our educators who are doing some of the most important work in our communities. Of course, I think we all agree that they deserve respect and fair pay and good working conditions that are comparable to those in primary and secondary schools teachers. We'll invest $10 million to fully implement the National Children's Education and Care Workforce Strategy, which is critical if we're going to do this transition and we're going to move towards universal. And of course, we will prioritise inclusion and equity, and some really strong recommendations in the PC report that we would like to see delivered. We also want to invest in to expand culturally safe First Nation-led services, and we'll work directly with First Nations organisations to design an appropriate funding model. In addition to that, we want to improve inclusive early learning for disabled children and families. This is the real reform that we think that families deserve. Our plan is fully costed, and it has been welcomed by some of the wonderful stakeholders we've worked with, including SNAIC and the Parenthood. I saw Georgie on the call. Hi, Georgie. We know that early education is the great equaliser in our society. It's about building a fairer, more equal society where our kids get the best start, where our families are supported, and really importantly, our educators are valued. So we're committed to working alongside the sector and the next government to deliver a vision for universal, high-quality, free early childhood education and care. Thanks, Sam.
Thank you. And sorry, I didn't mean to worry you that we were jumping ahead. But thank you to each of you for your opening statements. I think, we're getting a really good sense of where each of you see the priorities for reform going forward. And so we've got a question for each of you, which we've already shared with you, but I will share it with the participants. And I'm going to use first names if that's okay, rather than formal titles, just because it's getting late in the evening. I don't want to muck it up. But turning to you, Anne, as you mentioned, you were successful in getting the 3-day guarantee legislation passed in the last sitting period of the Parliament, and that changed the activity test to provide more an important step towards universal access. If you're re-elected, what do you see as the next steps in that reform process towards universal access?
Great. Thanks, Sam. Look, I'm so proud to be a part of the government that was able to pass the 3-day guarantee legislation in the very final sitting week. I do want to say thank you to Zoe and there were other members of the crossbench for their valuable input and their advocacy in getting that legislation through as well. Now, as everyone would be aware, there is absolutely no reliable evidence that the activity test ever increased workforce participation. All we know is that it locks out the most vulnerable and disadvantaged families from accessing early childhood education, including First Nations families and including families on lower incomes. So I think about myself as a single mother, a 25-year-old single mother. I would not have been able to access early childhood education and care for my 2 sons under the activity test as it was. Now, a lot of our stakeholders have echoed this. The activity test is retrograde, it's poorly designed policy, and it makes it tougher for women. That's been confirmed, of course, by multiple reviews, and Zoe mentioned some of them, but there was the ACCC review, the PC review, the Australian Institute of Family Studies, and, of course, the Impact Economics and Policy review. So the removal of the activity test and the replacement of it by the 3-day guarantee is going to benefit around 67,000 families, and around 100,000 families will have access to more hours of subsidised care. Now, regarding our next priorities, as I mentioned in my opening statements, we've announced that we are undertaking ambitious reform for a universal early learning system, early childhood education system. 4 pillars: workforce, building a strong workforce, and we've done some work towards that and recognise that more work needs to be done towards that. Affordability, we've done some work towards that and there's more work to be done towards that. Accessibility, I mentioned the Building Early Childhood Education Fund, and the fourth one is governance. Our next step is looking at what we're calling the service delivery price. And the service delivery price is really a data-driven understanding of the costs of delivering quality early childhood education in different contexts. That is going to underpin our future reform and where we go to next with our reform agenda on that pathway to a universal, high-quality early childhood education and care system.
Terrific. Thank you very much. Angie, you mentioned in your opening statement, and you have previously raised concerns about that difficulty of access, particularly in the regions and the so-called childcare deserts. If the coalition forms government after the election, could you just walk us through your steps to address that supply issue and improve access?
I think you hit the nail on the head there, Sam, when you talked about supply, because that is the key to delivering places around the country. And the regional areas are unique. They're not the same as those areas who already enjoy supply and enjoy access, and that is the served areas around the country. And so those unserved areas and underserved areas are the areas of most need. And that is why the Coalition has announced our $100 million over 2 years to start with. I announced that with David Littleproud, the leader of the National Party, a few weeks ago in a regional town in New South Wales, and it was very warmly met because regional Australians have different needs. They need more flexible hours. They need longer hours of care. They may need shorter hours of care. They may need after hours of care. And so the traditional long daycare model doesn't always work for those families who simply don't have access at the moment, and I think that's so very important. So there's a number of things that our fund will be able to be used for. It might be mobile services, it might be bush kindy services like Indie Kindy, for example, which, yes, sits outside the childcare subsidy, but within the national quality framework at the same time. So I think there are opportunities for local communities to come up with the solutions for how they can service their own families and their own children within, of course, the guidelines of the National Quality Framework and the Early Years Learning Framework, but not necessarily within the childcare subsidy inclusion. So it may be an employer-supported model that they can use the funding for, or it may be a family daycare off-site model that's in a community environment, in a hall or in a library, that, of course, as I said, meets all the standards, but has a bit more flexibility in terms of the model. So we want to see some innovation, and we want to see local solutions to those families who currently don't have access. We don't believe that the government will be able to deliver the centres that they're talking about. Last time they promised that they only built 38 after promising some 260. So we don't believe that we can trust them to build those. And if they do build them, then they risk having white elephants around the country, because as I've travelled around, there have been many regions that have said to me, including in Victoria, Zoe, that have said to me, even if you build a centre here, we won't be able to fill it with educators to come up to ratios and to even break even. So there's no point in building another centre here. For example, in the seat of Wannon down in Victoria and the Hamilton Council down there, they already have a number of council-run centres, and they said to me, we need 5 more centres, but there's no point in building them because we can't get the educators to fill them. And also, with our vast geography, we know that there are small towns that don't have enough children to go into a long daycare setting. And so while long daycare, of course, is a very important and biggest part of the sector, and not-for-profits are so very important, for-profits are so very important to make up the entire sector, it's so important that they all play their own role. I think there's a place for family daycare to expand, and certainly I've been speaking with the good people from in-home care as well. They were very pleased to have a meeting with me just a few days ago about this, being able to have more flexibility and choice in those areas of most need where families cannot have any access right now. And I think that is so very, very important in the bigger picture of access. So that's so important. With the activity test, I'll just say that this is $16 billion worth of taxpayer funding, and we feel that money should be means tested, and it should go to those families who need it the most, and that is families who are working. What Labor is doing with their 3-day guarantee is pitting families who are working against families who are not working. There are already inclusions for the most vulnerable in our community, and I'll say that it's so important. Those exemptions already exist, and so to meet the activity test is so very important to make sure that those families who need the subsidy and access get it. Thanks, Sam.
Thank you. It's tricky because we could have a very long conversation, I think, about the activity test and what has and hasn't worked about it, the intent of it versus what we see happening in practice. But we need to keep moving. There's also lots of commentary in the chat that I'd encourage all of you to have a quick look at if you can, including questions around in-home care, as we've touched on, and family daycare, as well as paid parental leave and whether parties have a position on that. So if you have a chance to look at those, welcome comments on any of the issues that our participants are raising. But we'll come to you, Zoe. You already touched on the fixed fee model, and I know that you have spoken about this in the Parliament and are committed to high quality but also affordability, and see some value in pursuing that fixed fee model. Could you talk to us about how you would pursue that into the future, how you see that potentially unfolding?
Thanks, Sam. As I alluded to in my opening statement, this is a stepped process, and if we're going to create a restructure that's akin to Medicare, then that has to be done carefully, and the implementation is really key. But I do want to see a universal early childhood education and care system, and I'm not in perfect alignment with the Greens on this, but I do agree with the principle that we accept that as taxpayers and as a society, we pay for kids to go to school, and this is part of that process. Early childhood education and care is education for children, and from that point of view, I think universality stacks up from both an economic and a social point of view. But obviously, to create a truly universal system, we need reform in 3 key areas. We need to support the workforce with decent pay and conditions, and also training to enable workers into those areas where it is difficult to find them. We need to address the market conditions that create childcare deserts and that fail families with additional needs or who experience some form of disadvantage, and which have been shown to drive poor quality among some providers. And we need to ensure that early childhood education and care is genuinely affordable for families. In my electorate of Goldstein, there are lots of options for early childhood education and care, but also the cost of early childhood education and care is incredibly expensive. So the issues are different in different parts of the country. Moving from a demand side funding system in the childcare subsidy to a fixed fee supply side funding system, I believe, will help to alleviate those 3 issues. So in order to begin that process of change, I intend to pursue what I'd like to call scaffolding legislation in the next term of government to help begin to establish the pathway for this change, potentially beginning through a private member's bill. I already have one sitting on my desk, or by working with whoever forms government to assist in delivering this. And this is part of the job of a member of the crossbench, to help create the social license for this kind of change, to provoke public conversation about it, and then to help be part of the ideas factory, not in a combative way, but in a collaborative way with whoever is in government to do it. So establishment of an early childhood commission, I think, is a starting point, and it would serve a couple of purposes. The first one is determining a national approach to regulatory standards. I think this should be a strong focus, especially after what we saw in the Four Corners investigation that revealed shocking mistreatment and exploitation of children in the childcare sector. And I absolutely agree with what Angie said, that the safety of kids has to be paramount. And I know everyone on this call would agree with that. And secondly, that an early childhood commission would also oversee the rolling out of a universal early childhood system where every child has access to quality, affordable, accessible care.
Thank you. And there's a lot of support for that notion of early childhood education as part of the continuum of education, but concerns about getting the funding model right and recognising that it costs different amounts to deliver services in different areas. But I would also say to different age groups of children is another your thunder, Steph. You have talked about free, high quality early childhood education and care, and changing the mix of providers, potentially phasing out for-profit providers. And I know that we have for-profit providers on the call, and I need to make it clear that's a Greens policy, not an ECA policy. But would you like us to just talk us through how you see that reform taking place, or what you think the next steps might look like?
Yeah, thank you, Sam. And just to be clear, we're not proposing a phase out of for-profit providers.
We know that. Apologies.
No, that's okay. We know that private providers.
We thought we were correct, but you correct the record, please.
No, not at all. Look, we know that private providers currently fill critical gaps, and that certainly can't change overnight. I think it's over 70% of the market now is private. So we're not proposing that phase out. But I just want to quickly touch on the activity test as well. And the Greens campaigned for many, many years to have that activity test removed. And We're still unsure why it's only been for 3 days. We're not interested to know why it was decided that 3 days was an adequate amount of time to have that guaranteed care. But yeah, there was some real Senate gymnastics that happened in one of the final weeks of Parliament to get that passed through the Senate and to get Labor to put that legislation up before the election. So I'm really glad that has been removed, and we'll continue to fight for the full removal for children to get free universal care. Look, we know that our plan is an ambitious one, but really we think that it has to be, because talking about the future of our kids, for us, there's very few things that are more important than that. And it comes back to that fundamental principle of this is an extension of our education, early, primary, secondary. So under our plan, instead of a means-tested payment that locks many children out of education, as I've mentioned, providers will receive a direct payment from the government with the condition that they must not charge families any fees for set hours of care above that. We'll also ensure high quality, inclusive and accessible childcare by baking it into the funding requirements. Providers will receive a payment per child based on the cost of providing early childhood education for 50 hours per week. And this funding would take into consideration, for example, the service type, the age of the children in care, and providers would opt into the funding with the condition that they wouldn't charge fees on top of that. To ensure no providers who opt into the funding model fall behind while we transition to the new system, they'll be eligible to receive an amount per child equivalent to the average cost that they receive per child under the CCS and out-of-pocket fees from families in 2024 to 2025, indexed in line with the existing fee growth cap, and thereafter in line with the ABS Childcare Services Cost Index. So we're really conscious that this is a transition. It's not going to happen overnight, and significant work needs to happen to determine what that funding model will look like. Preschool providers will continue to receive their preschool funding as part of the current preschool reform agreement. And then after this transitional period, the newly established Early Childhood Education Commission will determine the per child rates based on the location and a myriad of other factors. So when we're proposing that independent body is set up to determine what that fee structure looks like and that supply side funding looks like. We are very aware that demand will grow under a universal system. So that's why we're also investing in the Childcare Desert Fund that I spoke about earlier, and also grants to expand services in areas that need them most to ensure that we're plugging those gaps during the transition, as well as with the early learning sector and working with the early learning sector and unions to achieve higher professional pay and better working conditions for our educators. And I've seen some of the chat and fully agree, it's not just pay, it's those working conditions that are really, really critical, and keen to continue engaging beyond tonight about how we can advocate and lobby for that in the next term of Parliament. The Independent Commission will oversee the allocation of funding to ensure that the gaps are filled by additional government or not-for-profit providers, guaranteeing continued continuity and access to high-quality services. So it's certainly not proposing that overnight things are free. There's a transitionary period, and there's an independent body tasked with that role of determining those fees. And they'll also do a lot of data gathering that hasn't happened historically. I know that it's quite fragmented right across the nation, and that's something I hear regularly from providers and also people in the sector. So we think that commission, there's pretty widespread support amongst, I know that the Teals have, the independents have proposed a similar ECA Commission, Productivity Commission has done so similarly. So we're really hopeful that in the next term of Parliament we can start to lay some of these foundations.
Terrific. Thank you very much. And does feel like there's some differences, but also some consensus building around some key areas. It would come as no surprise to you, just number of questions we received to put to you all were around the workforce issues and the workforce crisis that the sector is experiencing, how you might address those. And I'm going to combine in the issue of wage increases, and particularly you will see that there's been questions about the Worker Retention Grant. There's also been questions about the Fair Work Commission gender evaluation case, and how we can address wages and conditions. And so if I could give each of you an opportunity to address that briefly, because we do want to try and get through as many questions as we can. We're moving now into stakeholder questions. But I might reverse the order and come back to you, Steph. Do you have some particular reform ideas you want to put on the agenda around wages and conditions? and addressing workforce shortages?
Yeah, look, early learning for workforce, backbone of our early learning system. I think that's, we all agree with that. Too long, we believe that the educators have been underpaid and undervalued, leading to burnout and mass departures, and we're very aware of that. And look, the recent temporary wage increase was a hard one, but we think only a first step. And we've, as I mentioned in my opening, we've consistently backed a 25% wage increase to educators, and for that to extend beyond the current 2-year agreement. I've asked the minister responsible in the Senate many times what happens after that 2 years. A lot of providers have come to me saying, we want to implement this pay increase, but what happens after that 2-year period? What if we can't? We then have to pass that on as a fee increase to families or reduce our educator wages, and that is deeply troubling to us. So we would really like some certainty beyond that 2-year period. We are committed to working alongside the sector, of course, and the unions to secure higher pay and conditions, and that includes full implementation of the actions in the National Children's Education and Care Workforce Strategy to ensure, of course, that we can meet the growing demand without compromising quality. It also means that we need to ensure that working conditions are comparable, as I said, to primary and secondary educators, with things like really simple things like paid time for planning. And it must also be pay parity with other educator roles. We don't think that pay should be a decision point for someone as to whether they go into early childhood, primary or secondary. That shouldn't be. It should be which age group that they want to educate, rather than which one is going to help them afford growing rental and grocery costs. Our plan also includes a commitment of $50 million to develop measures to increase access to high-quality training, including, of course, targeted support and programs for First Nations and culturally and linguistically diverse communities. And we know these things are vital because these communities are often underrepresented in early learning and therefore more developmentally vulnerable when they start school. So it's really... we need some more certainty. We need some more parity across the different levels of education. And again, something that I'll be really pushing if I'm re-elected this weekend in the next term of Parliament.
Thank you. Zoe, turning to you, workforce wages and conditions.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. Look, of course, there is no early childhood education and care without early childhood educators, and everyone on this call would know that this has been a historically undervalued sector, like the care sector as a whole, which is a bit ridiculous considering that the care sector is the fastest growing sector of our economy and should be valued as such. But of course, the Australian labour market is highly gender segregated by industry and occupation, and this is one of the reasons why I'm really happy to sit in the Australian Parliament, to be able to speak up for particularly women who work in the care sector, who historically have not had a voice in the seat of power, if you like. Because, of course, that segregation of women and men in the economy is a key driver of pay inequality. So in Goldstein, in my electorate of the 1,500 early childhood educators, here 95% are women. And if men are working in the childcare sector, they're more likely to be childcare centre managers than any other type of role in my electorate. So I was really pleased to campaign for and support the increase, 15% pay increase for staff in the sector, incredibly well deserved and needed. And of course, that pay increase will go some way to supporting women and families with cost of living pressures, and also help attract and retain workers to the early childhood education and education sector. We know that educators must have decent pay and conditions, and recent Jobs and Skills Australia data shows that there was a 22% drop in vacancies, demonstrating that pay and conditions are critical to building that workforce. I will also add that one of the legislative changes that I was really proud to make in the form of an amendment was to Jobs and Skills Australia, that legislation, in order that that organisation has to consider women and feminised industries in all of its decision making, and this is one of the key sectors that does need to be considered. So I want to work with whoever forms government to secure ongoing funding for the worker retention grant beyond 2026. We absolutely cannot have a situation where educators lose that pay increase, and I would hope that doesn't happen, but that is something that I think is really critical. And then beyond that, I would support many of the actions included in ECA's 10-year workforce strategy, particularly around supporting educator and teacher education, mentoring and professional development, and also wellbeing support, because as Steph has mentioned, burnout is real. Working in any care sector is really challenging, and we have to acknowledge that, particularly given that these are feminised industries where often the staff are also caring for their own young children, and often they're ageing parents while simultaneously caring for kids during their working day.
Thank you. And Angie?
Thanks, Sam. I just want to highlight that the Coalition didn't stand in the way of the increase to educators' wages, because they deserve a pay rise, and we want to see higher wages across the country. I guess the question about it ongoing could be one for the Minister, as it was the government's design in terms of when it runs out. It was the Labor government that designed this program, and I did raise some concerns at the time through an amendment to the legislation to highlight some of the difficulties with the way the government has delivered this worker retention payment, because the latest numbers are 34% of educators have received that. It's been bungled at best, and there is a lot of uncertainty across the sector, and particularly for educators and teachers, 200,000 workers, and when you consider only 34% of them have received it. There are also a lot of centres, some not-for-profit centres as well, who are still waiting to be paid when they have paid their educators up front. And when you think about 5 months, almost going into 6 months, where they've had to pay their educators, their staff up front, and still haven't received their payment, is a disgrace. And I think that the government and the department need to get their skates on and deliver this money around the country to those people and those business people who are hurting, small owners of services, 1 or 2 services who haven't been paid yet. But I've even got one here, a not-for-profit centre, community childcare centre in my electorate on the Gold Coast, who still hasn't received it. So I think there's some problems with the way the government's delivered it, and I think the sector needs to be very closely consulted with around the Fair Work Commission's provisional decision, so that we understand the ramifications as well to the budget bottom line. And I note that the government hasn't had much to say on this when it was something that they put forward when the Fair Work Commission recently came out with a number. And so I think there's still a lot of work to do across the sector to make sure that we value our educators, because, yes, I do agree with the sentiment that you are all very important, those of you who are online, educators, directors, teachers, all of you who work in centres and deliver these services, so crucial, these services to families. And I would say that each part of the sector has a very important role to play. And if you start looking at supply-side funding, changing the funding model very quickly, as the Greens have outlined, then you risk supply. And a few of you have said demand will increase. Well, if demand increases at the same side that supply decreases because it's simply not sustainable, then we will have a sector that looks like a train wreck. And so I would caution against huge changes to the system that has served our country very well to this point, and fast changes as well. And everybody that's listening knows what I'm talking about in terms of how the sector works with the not-for-profits and the for-profits, family daycare, with in-home care, with all of these parts of the sector and the role that they play. And they have served, in the main, our country very well. And when I say in the main, I mean there are obviously those bad actors, and we've seen some reports on that are terrible, but in the main, we know that our educators do a wonderful job for families across the nation, and that you're all in it. I've never met an educator or a person that works in early learning who doesn't love their job and who aren't in it to care for the children and to be in that environment. So that's our position, and I look forward to hearing what the Minister has to say about the worker retention payment.
Thank you. Well, we'll hear from her now, and I'm sure you're keen to weigh in on this one.
Oh, thanks, Sam. It's so I'm trying to read the comments or also trying to listen and try. But on the issue of workforce, one of the comments here, I think, put it beautifully. They said, without dealing with workforce issues, any reform is like putting flowers in a broken vase. I think that's quite a poignant way of putting it, and I think that's really encapsulates the reason why workforce is one of those 4 pillars of reform that I talked about on our journey to universal early childhood education: governance, workforce, affordability, and accessibility. We're focused on, when we talk about workforce, we talk about the attraction, the retention, and the training of early childhood workers. We start off with remuneration, because remuneration for a long time has been an issue. When I first got elected in 2016, I signed up to the Big Steps campaign, committing to supporting an increase in the wages of early childhood educators in 2016. And it was 8 years later, as part of a Labor government, that we were finally able to deliver an increase to the wages of early childhood educators. But even before that, there were crucial things that we did to make it easier for early childhood educators and their representatives to go to the Fair Work Commission and argue a case for fair pay. We made gender equality an object of the Fair Work Act. We strengthened the ability of the Fair Work Commission to order pay rises for underpaid workforces, particularly highly feminised workforces like early childhood education and care. And then, of course, we have the 15% wage rise as an interim step, and we introduced that as an interim step while the Fair Work Commission completed its gender under evaluation review. And the reason that we did that is because we recognise the urgency of addressing workforce issues as one of those key pillars of reform. Putting flowers in a broken vase, if I might repeat that. But as many of the commentators here have said, valuing early childhood educators is not just about remuneration. That's just one part of it. And I am reminded of a time when I was travelling around the country talking to early childhood educators, and I sat in a room with early childhood educators, and they were telling me about the financial impost of having to do their pracs. And I said to them, would it help if we funded your pracs or if we funded your PD? As a direct result of that interaction, we introduced a $72 million package of workforce measures that has been a great success, helping to support skills and training for over 71,000 educators already. That's through subsidies to complete training, to complete pracs, and support to complete prac exchanges as well. The other thing that we've done, and that I think is quite important to mention here, is fee-free TAFE. You know, early childhood education and care is the second most popular course. The Cert 3 is the second most popular course in our fee-free TAFE. We have pledged, if re-elected, the Labor government, to make fee-free TAFE permanent, a permanent feature, as it should be. I'm speaking to you also as a former TAFE teacher at one time in my life as well, as it should be. So you're looking at building that strong workforce, remuneration, looking at the conditions to retain the workforce as well, whether it's supporting them in PD, supporting them in training, and of course bringing in a new pipeline of educators through fee-free TAFE.
Sorry, you froze on me for a minute there. So hopefully it was just me and not everybody else.
I couldn't feel that
I think it was
there's
just
only 7% completion of fee-free TAFE in early childhood education and care. But anyway.
I think there's a completion
not a
issue
debate.
across all RTO provider types, to be fair, but it is something we need to address, that pipeline of people coming into the sector and completing their qualifications, and also having a reasonable journey entering and onboarding into the sector, because we have more and more people starting without a qualification and then studying while they're working. I think for whoever forms the next government, the workforce issues are quite complex, but it is good to hear that they're on all of your respective agendas, and that there are a number of potential solutions being put forward. So that's terrific. Thank you. We're going to have to really skate through some other issues to make sure we cover some ground. So I'm going to ask you to keep responses really short, and some of these questions you might want to speak to, you might not, so that's fine. We're not going to ask everybody to respond to, but respond to every question. Another pressing issue that many people raised was as we move to a universal system, and as we see a change in the cohort of children coming into services, and as we come out of the COVID era, increasingly services report high numbers of children with behaviours that are challenging, with disabilities, with additional needs. That has put a lot of pressure on inclusion support, both individual inclusion support and the inclusion support agencies. And I'd just be really interested in if you have anything to add to what you have already said. Let's not cover ground that we've already gone over, but if you have anything to add to things you've already put forward in terms of addressing inclusion support as we bring in a broader cohort of children, I'd invite you to do that now. Do you want to just give me a nod if you'd like to say something on this issue? Steph, Anne, yeah, Angie, absolutely, great. Steph, would you like to kick us off?
Yeah, look, as part of the plan we've put forward, there's $500 million in there over 4 years in grant funding to help early learning services become more inclusive. I would also point to some of the Productivity Commission suggestions, recommendations around the inclusion support program. For example, increasing the additional educator subsidy to match wages, which hasn't increased since 2016, which is just wild. We're 2025 now, almost 10 years on, and we want to index it and remove limits on subsidised hours to align with children's attendance, providing immediate support while services gather documentation for the additional educator subsidy. That's something that's been raised with me frequently by providers, and streamlining processes to reduce delays and improving communication of funding requirements are all things that we would really welcome the opportunity to work with the government on. I recognise I think John Cherry's on here, and we've spoken about the immense administrative burden that it can take, and also the additional costs that other families are paying to subsidise those that inclusivity, which really the government needs to step up and play a more leading role in addressing those Productivity Commission recommendations.
Thank you. Anne?
Thanks, Sam. Look, I think inclusion has to be a real central part of any reform that we do. Right now, we've got the ISP. I'm acutely aware that the program is not fit for purpose, and I've raised this and I've asked for a review of it. The ISP, currently we have invested another $203 million in funding to help meet demand, and that's on top of the annual appropriation of $133 million a year in funding to the ISP. But this is where I want to bring in the service delivery price again, because the service delivery price is going to be key to our future reforms. It will give us an indication of the cost of delivering early childhood education and care services in different settings and among different cohorts. Right? What I want to be able to do with the service delivery price and the reforming of any kind of way in which we fund early childhood education and care is not to have inclusion as a semicolon and, not to have inclusion as an add-on, because children with disabilities and people living with disabilities and children with special needs, culturally and linguistically diverse, First Nations children deserve better than that. They deserve to be part and parcel of a system that considers their needs just as much as anybody else's needs. So that's where I want to just clarified the point here about future reform. That service delivery price and the aspiration that I have that our future reform would build inclusion in to how we deliver early childhood education and care, not make it an extra addition.
Thank you. And Angie?
Oh, it's good to hear the Minister's thoughts on the Inclusion Support Program, because we haven't actually seen a formal response to the Inclusion Support Program review from the government at the moment. But I can see you shirking a little bit, Sam, because of time. So I will make my response very, very, very short. I'll just say that I'm very open-minded, want to work with the sector, want to work with the states and territories to take some pressure off the educators who are under so much pressure with the changing needs of families. And the additional pressure that it puts on families as well. This is an important area where we're seeing more and more children who need support. And I'm open to working with all of you across the sector. I understand the needs of families and I understand the needs of services, but how we move forward with it, I'm absolutely an open book working with you collaboratively to support those families who need it.
Thank you. And I know it's not for me to speak in this forum, but I would say I think there are some short-term quick wins we could do to improve the inclusion support program and some longer-term reform. And we would like to work with the next Parliament on both the short-term and the long-term fixes. And there's some really good suggestions in the chat that I would point you to. Of course, Aboriginal community-controlled organisations are often held up as the gold standard of inclusion practice. They are usually supported to do multi-purpose support to families and children. And so, there have been conversations over the years about the model and the funding model, and that being potentially a way that the broader sector could move in terms of providing more inclusive and welcoming services. Steph, you touched on a funding model for Aboriginal community-controlled organisations. Is there anything you wanted to add to that, or have we covered that ground already?
I think I covered it in my opening as well. In the interest of time, I'm happy to park it.
Lovely, thank you. Angie, anything you'd like to say on that topic?
Yeah, look, I'd point to a couple of things, certainly that the Coalition did in government, which was to set up the Community Childcare Fund and the Connected Beginning Stream. That would, of course, continue. That's a very successful program that reaches a lot of Indigenous children around the country. We want to work with communities. Obviously, on the Closing the Gap Target 3, that is on track with children enrolled in the year before school, but Target 4, obviously, there's a lot of work to be done with children who are starting school developmentally behind. I think not using the one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to Indigenous communities and ACOs. I think that I'd point again to the model Indie Kindy, for example, that we funded through that we funded in the last government, and I believe the Labor government's finally come to the table with that. They've been asking for only $1 million to keep their program going up in the Northern Territory. It's a wonderful program that delivers results for children, and I point to that $100 million Raising the Regions fund that can be used by organisations like that to keep their service sustainable. So that's very, very important. We'll also, under a Dutton-led coalition government, would be conducting audits of those organisations to make sure the money is going where it is needed most, and that's so very, very important to make sure that those ACOs are getting the money that they need, and that they are delivering that money to where it's needed most in the community.
Thank you. Anne, would you like to add to that?
Just to give a quick rundown of what we're already working towards. So we've got the Connected Beginnings program, the Community Childcare Fund Restricted Expansion program, and the Early Childhood Care and Development Policy Partnership between government and First Nations representatives. I just want to make the point also, because it's an important point, that all governments have committed to developing and implementing the advice on 2 research reports that were commissioned through the Early Childhood Policy Partnership. This includes a report that explores ACO funding models, and that report was led by Snake. We will continue to work in partnership with First Nations stakeholders to build ACCOs, as well as to consider the best way to build cultural safety of non-ACCO services as well.
Thanks, you. Yes, and thank you. Everybody's keeping it brief. I wish we had longer because there's so much ground I'd still like to cover. But Zoe, I might come to you first. So there have been we have touched on tonight the issues of that doesn't mean it's at all acceptable. Of course, it's not acceptable for any child to be harmed in early childhood education and care ever. However, where do you see the regulatory and standards enforcement reform needs of the sector? And there's been a few questions in the chat, and I would ask each of you to consider, because I'll come to you. People are asking, where do you see an ECEC commission sitting with a CEQA? Is it instead of? Is it as well as? What does that look like? And we do have, of course, a national framework and quality standards, but we have differences in enforcements around the country. So I don't want to put you each on the spot necessarily, but if you have some thoughts on what you think we might be looking to achieve in the next term of Parliament around regulatory enforcement and quality standards and the safety of children, then this would be a good time to share it with us.
Thanks, Sam, and I'll be brief because I can see we're running out of time. But I think that the central issue that we have is inconsistency across the country, and I can see in the chat, comments about a whole lot of different organisations who are working within the space, and that creating red tape and overlap, and perhaps cost and benefit of introducing another organisation. But I think that the examples that were given in the Four Corners report obviously point to issues that need to be weeded out. The idea of an early childhood commission, which has been proposed by me, and then you've got the model that's being put forward by the Greens, is determine a national approach to those regulatory standards and to try to iron out some of those inconsistencies. So to set a national standard and also to weed out unscrupulous operators and to make sure that there is rigour in the oversight of the sector. I think too that, things like working with children checks, we know differ wildly between the states and territories, and that they don't intersect effectively enough. So there are even some simple things like that need to be resolved. But I think, whether it replaces existing organisations or intersects with them is part of a process of putting this thing together, and I agree with Angie to the extent that we can't put the cart before the horse here. We need to actually step through what the best approach is and just how to make that work in order to improve the system, not to create more issues within it.
Thank you. I'm showing my age a bit, but the national approach to working with children check has been on the agenda for at least 20 years. But will we see changes there in the next term of Parliament, do you think, Anne? Is that on the agenda?
Look, let me first of all say that nothing is more important than child safety. But I also want to make the point that overwhelmingly children are well looked after and are well educated by the dedicated educators in early childhood education and care that are professionals in what they do. There are, however, a small number of providers that quite frankly and without argument, who consistently fail children and therefore should not be operating. Now, I'm sure everyone knows here the regulatory framework. You've got states and territories responsible for regulation, and the Commonwealth holds the kind of the levers through the CCS. In 2023, Jason Clare, the Minister for Education, and I asked for a review of child safety, and there were a number of recommendations that came out of that. Those recommendations were taken to the Education Ministers' meetings, the EMM, with every jurisdiction agreeing in principle to those recommendations. Among those recommendations, there were recommendations that are outside of the jurisdiction of early childhood education and care ministers and education ministers. For example, working with children checks is more with the Attorney General's jurisdiction. Following the Four Corners report, I then gave a ministerial statement where I had asked ASIQA to consider if there were any further actions we could do around child safety. They came back with some other ideas, and they were to stop providers who persistently fail to meet minimum standards from getting in, other government subsidies. And you'll have seen in the news today that one of those providers that was exposed in the Four Corners program, who then went on to open an NDIS business, has now been denied the ability to continue that NDIS business. We're also looking at compliance action against providers who persistently fail to meet minimum standards, and that cross-sector banning arrangements across different sectors. We're going to continue to consult closely with the sector and with the states on these changes. I do want to refer, however, to the commission that was recommended by the PC. Again, I'll go back to those 4 pillars that I mentioned, and you'll recognise that one of those pillars that I talked about was governance. I'm looking at governance. I'm looking at all the different kinds of models of governance that would work best with what we want to achieve, and continuing to consult with the sector about what would work best with what we want to achieve. I think one of the things that we would look at in governance is also how do we feed up local intel up through upstream, as opposed to governance being only top down. So there are some issues there that I'd like to explore more further within that kind of that pillar of governance.
Thank you. I'm turning to you, Angie, in terms of regulatory enforcement and quality standards. And you've also talked a bit about flexibility, and we certainly have found there's quite a different view on flexible models across the state and territory regulatory authorities. So do you have some thoughts on what might be achievable in the next parliamentary term?
Well, look, I think there are a few areas, but I would just say that I offer my in-principle support and Coalition's in-principle support for the work that the Minister is doing with states and territories. We would continue that work to ensure that bad actors are weeded out. I think there was one thing that really stood up to me, which was until a service is meeting the National Quality Framework, they shouldn't be able to open another service. I mean, that's a no-brainer. I'm not sure what the difficulties are around making that come to light very quickly, but that's certainly something that I would investigate promptly, because I think it's something that could be done. These things between the National Quality Framework and the state regulators, state and territory regulators, are difficult to navigate, as the Minister would probably acknowledge. You've got each regulator in each state doing their own thing, and there are difficulties for services who tell me across different states and territories that the auditing's different. Some of them are outsourced, some of them aren't. It's a difficult area when it comes to regulation, and rolling back any regulations when we're talking about children's safety is really not on the table. So, I think there are some areas that could be improved. How long they'll take and what the legislative process around that is something that I would turn my mind to immediately.
It might be something that the Commonwealth can do more easily, but I know one of the state governments tried to stop outside school hours from opening new sites when they weren't meeting standards at existing sites, and it was very difficult and didn't work. But I'm not a legal expert, and I don't know what the complexities were, but good to hear that that is being given consideration by both sides of politics, because I think it's a good solution. Steph, you touched on this as well and have talked about the ECA Commission. Can you speak briefly to that and the relationship you see between that and ASIQA?
Yeah, look, to begin with, I think like many, I've got a 2-year-old who's still in early childhood education and care, and really was deeply disturbed by the reports coming out of Four Corners about the abuse and neglect at some early childhood providers, not all, obviously, some. And so we called for a Royal Commission after that. We don't want that to happen at the exclusion of setting up a commission. I just want to be really clear there. We think that there are things that we can be doing right now to start to improve quality and standards. But we do think that there are systemic issues that we really want to get to the bottom of through a Royal Commission. Look, the ECEC Commission that I've spoken about will be modelled on the ACCC, would oversee state and territory regulators. It'll enforce quality standards and crack down on those dodgy operators. And I suppose one of the key things is that it wouldn't replace a CEQA, which plays, we know, a really important role in monitoring and reporting on the quality of care in Australia, but there is currently no national body that enforces quality standards or monitors early learning. So for us, we think that that enforcement mechanism is really important and that power is really important. The ministerial statement, step in the right direction, but we do think that it is a band-aid to a much bigger structural issue, and that this ECEC Commission, emboldened and set up like the ACCC with those powers, is a crucial next step to keeping our kids safe.
Thank you. I'm going to be getting the wind up any minute from the team. And there were a whole load of questions that we didn't get to. And I want to say thank you to all the participants. The chat is being recorded and you can go back to the recording. And of course, we will collate all of this information as we move on from the election and into the next cycle of Parliament. But I did want to, and food insecurity. And there is such a wealth of evidence that tells us we do have far too many children, well over, estimates of 12%, some estimates up to 1 million children who are experiencing very real economic disadvantage, experiencing poverty and food insecurity. And while much of our conversation has been on early childhood education and care, and that's not surprising, with that is by far the large proportion of our membership, could we finish with some broader perspective on what we might do for those children most at risk of poor outcomes, both educational outcomes and lifelong wellbeing? And I might, again, reverse the order and start with you, Steph, and then Zoe, Angie and Anne, if that's okay.
Yeah, thank you, Sam, and thank you for your wonderful facilitation this evening if I don't get another chance to speak, and to my colleagues for joining us in this really busy week. Look, this is a really important point. Basically, we need to reform and improve our income support in this nation. The Greens have a plan to increase income support payments to above the poverty line. It sounds crazy that we need to say above the poverty line, and invest in other supports such as housing and health, just critical to ensure that no one in this wealthy country is living in poverty. We've also proposed an independent poverty and inequality commission to define and eliminate poverty in Australia. Really important. We also, I'm going to keep it brief, but expand things like social housing and remove harmful mutual obligations that are associated with income support. Here in my home state of Victoria, public housing is being demolished and not being replaced. And we know that this really healthy, secure upbringing is just so important for a child's learning, for their health and wellbeing. And we also, we've recently announced a policy that would ensure that there were free lunches provided at every public school across the country. Let's look at how we can expand that to make sure that no kids going hungry, that they've got a secure roof over their head, and that they are above the poverty line in this country. It's a political choice, and for too many, for too long, it has been a choice, I think, that our parliamentarians have failed us on. 1 in 3 corporations pay no tax in this country. They pay, like, childhood educators pay more tax than Qantas. They pay more tax than Amazon. It's really, I think, got to shift, and hopefully we can take it to the next government in balance of power to ensure that our kids get that really important early years education and aren't living in poverty.
Thank you. And turning to you, Zoe, and any other final comments that you'd like to make?
Thanks, Sam. It's really good that you've come to this, actually, and I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to say that I've supported ACOS's call for a lift to job seeker youth allowance and parenting payment and related payments. There is abundant evidence to suggest, including from the Economic Inclusion Advisory Committee, that kind of measure would deliver a roughly 24% return on investment through improved physical and mental health across the population, wellbeing and productivity, and also obviously to support the kids that we're talking about who are growing up in poverty and food insecurity. We saw during COVID where we saw a lift to income support payments, just how that affected people's mental and physical health. And I really do believe in that cost benefit analysis, that I think that we can support that as a nation. I'll also just further add that I support Children's Commissioner Anne Holland's call for a federal minister for children. I think there are a range of issues involving children's rights that are currently spread across a range of portfolios, and not taking anything away from Anne and the work that she's doing in this portfolio. But obviously our young people are facing a range of challenges currently, both as young children but also into their teens. And I think that there's merit across a range of areas, including family, domestic and sexual violence, child maltreatment and trauma, housing insecurity, kids growing up in poverty, mental health issues that could be addressed through that kind of portfolio.
Thank you. And thank you for your time tonight. Angie?
Thank you, Sam, for this very important forum, to my colleagues as well, and to everybody who's put all of those, all of their comments there. I didn't get to read all of them, but there was certainly some really good input there from those of you from around the country who have dialed in today. So thank you so much for joining us. This is of real concern, and even in some of the wealthier areas, can I say, around the country, this is a problem. Food security is expanding. Insecurity is expanding across the nation. There are 2 million families who are experiencing food insecurity struggles at the moment, and even at I must say, one of the premier schools in my electorate here on the Gold Coast, I've had young people come up to me and say, "Can you help those children who are coming to school without their lunch?" And this is due to the cost of living crisis that Australians have been facing under this government's watch as well. What I will say is that the Coalition has pledged $50 million to Food Bank, OzHarvest and Second Bite to assist with this. And we also saw the leader of the Coalition pledge $19.5 million for Food Bank South East Queensland for a new distribution centre for them. I work very closely with my local charities and matching them with local schools as well for the breads and spreads programs that they have to help children, because without something in their tummy, they can't learn anything. We know that they can't focus on what's ahead of them with learning, and education, of course, is so very, very important to their development and well-being. So the Coalition has a plan to also bring down inflation, bring down the cost of living, help Australians with making ends meet, so that the pressure is taken off families, so they're not choosing between heating or eating this winter, which is just getting worse and worse and worse under this government. So thank you all again for your time, and thank you, Sam, at ECA for this forum.
Thank you. And lastly to Anne.
Thanks, Sam, and if I don't get a chance, thank you to ECA and to you, Sam, for putting this on, and to my colleagues as well for joining us. I'm really glad that this question was raised, because I have, since taking on this role, advocated for a more holistic lens over early childhood education and care, that where we only look at it through the lens of education, or if we only look at it through a particular lens, we don't get a more holistic picture of those first 5 years of a child's life, which are critical to child's brain development. And of course, food security plays a huge role in that. I will come back to, again, the point about the activity test and removing the activity test, and how important and fundamental that is to ensure that children, the most vulnerable children, do have access to early childhood education and care, where indeed many of them will have access to nutritional food in early childhood education and care settings that they may not otherwise have had if they are locked out of early childhood education and care because of what their parents do or don't do. So I come back to the fundamental point here of how important it was to ensure that every child has access and the opportunity to thrive in those first 5 years through access to early childhood education and care.
Make sure you include food in your cost delivery model, Anne.
It will be. In the bigger... But
you heard it here first.
Yeah. Just on the bigger issue of cost of living pressures, since being elected, we've committed $170 million in financial wellbeing programs. That includes emergency relief, food relief, financial counselling, other supports like pre-crisis and early intervention programs. We've got a strong and committing to a strong and sustainable social safety net. The eligibility for single parenting payment is now providing more support for around 100,000 single parents, the majority of whom are women. That was when we expanded the eligibility for the single parenting payment. We've increased the base rate of JobSeeker. We're looking at $200 million investment in partnering with philanthropy, empowering communities, and enhancing place-based and social impact investing approaches. And we've made other significant investments to ease cost of living. But I do want to come back, Sam, to the point about taking a more holistic lens to early childhood, to those first 5 years, and a developmental lens to early childhood, where we can look at the place of early childhood education and care in a child's development, recognise the value of early childhood education and care and the significance of it to a child's early development, but also look at what else we can be doing around ensuring that those critical first 5 years of a child's life, the capacity that we have to change the trajectory of a child's life in those first 5 years, to ensure that no child born into disadvantage should have to carry that disadvantage through their lives. It's a pivotal moment in time for us to ensure that we can do that we get it right, whether it's in early childhood education and care, whether it's in other foundational supports for children as well.
Thank you. Can I say this is the third time ECA has hosted an election forum, and it is very heartening to hear informed, interested across you all, but there's also a lot of common ground and agreement about the priorities. And I'm really starting to think we should do this forum on the other side of the election, when you all hopefully have a role to play in the new parliament, and we can get into some of the nitty-gritty issues that people have been raising in the chat and we just can't get to in the time frame that we have, including family daycare, in-home care, outside school hours. When we are talking about early childhood education, we are talking about this big diverse system that includes all of those different models, but I do recognise that we haven't got to some of the tin tacks and the policy detail that will be a high priority for ECA and for the sector more broadly post the election. But I wanted to a very sincere thank you to all of you for your thoughtful preparation, for your contribution, for making the time for us tonight. We didn't quite get the numbers that we had registered, but I'm sure that's because people are going to watch the recording, and it will have been live streamed on the social platforms as well. So I'm sure you reached a lot of people, and there's been such a lot of commentary in the chat. If you didn't get a chance, please do go and have a look at that. To all our participants, thanks for making the time tonight. Just to clarify, ECA is the national peak with a mandate to focus on the interests of children. We're not aligned to any political party or particular policy positions. We do have policy positions, but we're not aligned to any positions that have been put forward by particular parties tonight. If you want to know more about our positions, look at our submissions and our statements that are all available on our website. We are very transparent and very open about the positions that we do take and do support, so you can find out more information there. And of course, it would be neglectful of me not to say, don't forget to vote on Saturday. If you haven't already done so, please make sure that you do take what you've heard tonight and give it some thought, and turn up at a polling booth on Saturday. Thank you very much, and thank you to my events team that have been working really hard behind the scenes to coordinate tonight, and to each of you again. Best of luck. I can only imagine how stressful and tired you must all be feeling, but thank you so much for making the time tonight.